There comes a point in life when something quietly shifts inside you. It's not when someone leaves. It's not when a relationship ends. It's when you look at someone you've known for years and for the first time realize that maybe you never truly saw the person standing in front of you. You saw what you expected to find. The intentions you assumed were there, the affection you believed existed behind certain gestures, the potential you were convinced would eventually reveal itself. And whenever reality contradicted that image, your mind found an explanation. She's going through a difficult time. He didn't mean it that way. Eventually things will change. But what if they don't? What if what you've been calling an exception is actually a pattern? Carl Jung devoted much of his work to exploring the unconscious forces that shape the way we perceive ourselves and other people. Among those forces is projection, the tendency to perceive in others something that belongs, at least partly, to our own inner psychological world. And that changes the question entirely. Maybe the question isn't simply, who is this person? Maybe it's also, what have I placed onto this person in order to love them, admire them, or tolerate them? Because there's a profound difference between knowing someone and knowing the story we've created about them. And the day that difference becomes impossible to ignore can be painful. But it may also be the beginning of a kind of freedom you haven't experienced before. Imagine discovering that one of the most important people in your life isn't exactly who you thought they were. They still have the same face, the same voice. They may still be sitting across from you, talking exactly the way they always have. Nothing appears to have changed. And yet, everything has, because you've started noticing things you couldn't see before. A lack of reciprocity you used to call distraction. Emotional coldness you explained away as difficulty expressing feelings. A series of broken promises you insisted on treating as isolated incidents. And then an unsettling possibility emerges. What if you're not watching someone change? What if you're simply beginning to see them? This is where the idea of projection becomes so important. We rarely encounter another person with a completely blank mind. We bring our desires, experiences, wounds, expectations, and unconscious images with us. All of those things can shape the way we interpret the person standing in front of us. You meet someone and see potential. They show you affection a few times, and your mind fills in the rest of the story. They reveal one quality you've desperately wanted to find in someone, and little by little, that quality begins occupying far too much space in your perception of them. You no longer see only who they are. You begin seeing who you believe they could become. And there's an enormous difference between the two. Someone's potential isn't a promise. A person may be capable of becoming more generous and still continue choosing selfishness. They may be capable of maturity and continue repeating the same behavior. They may understand perfectly well what hurts you and continue doing it anyway. But when we're emotionally involved, we don't relate only to facts, we also relate to expectations. That's why some relationships survive for years on the strength of one silent sentence. One day they'll understand. One day they'll appreciate me. One day they'll change. One day they'll understand everything I've done for them. One day they'll finally become the person I've always believed was hidden somewhere inside them. And one day can consume years of your life. Maybe that's why certain disappointments hurt so disproportionately. You're not simply losing someone. You're losing a version of that person that existed inside your mind. And there's a particular kind of grief in that. You start revisiting old memories. Things they said that once seemed insignificant suddenly sound different. Behaviors you used to excuse begin forming a picture. What once looked like a collection of unrelated incidents begins revealing itself as a pattern. And this is usually where the mind starts resisting, because recognizing the pattern also means recognizing all the times you had to minimize it in order to preserve the image you wanted to believe. Not because you're naive, but because the human psyche doesn't observe relationships like a neutral camera. We interpret, we project, we hope, we fear, and very often we prefer an interpretation we can live with over a reality that hurts. But there's something even deeper happening. Sometimes we project onto another person precisely what we long to find within ourselves: strength, security, wisdom, courage, love. When that happens, the other person can take on an extraordinary psychological significance. Their approval starts to matter too much. Their absence becomes unbearable. Their rejection begins to feel like a final judgment on your own worth. But perhaps some of that power never belonged to them. Perhaps we gave it to them. And withdrawing a projection doesn't mean deciding that the other person is evil. That's essential. Seeing someone for who they are doesn't mean demonizing them. It means allowing facts to carry more weight than fantasy. Someone can have genuine qualities and still be incapable of giving you the relationship you imagined. They can care about you and still repeatedly hurt you. They can have a painful history and still be responsible for the way they treat other people. Understanding someone doesn't require you to distort what you're seeing. Maybe this is one of the hardest forms of psychological maturity, learning to hold two truths at the same time. I understand why you are this way. And, even understanding that, I can still see what this does to me. That's when something begins to break. Not necessarily the relationship. The fantasy breaks first. And when a fantasy collapses, there's often a brief period when the world feels colder. You may even wish you could go back to when that excuse still worked, back to when a promise was enough, back to when you could still confuse hope with evidence. But once consciousness recognizes something clearly, it's difficult to make it unseen again. A pattern you've truly recognized doesn't easily become invisible, and maybe that's where the real transformation begins. Because the question stops being, when will this person finally become who I know they can be? And becomes, if they never change, can I accept who they're showing me they are today? That question changes everything, because you're no longer negotiating with the future. You're looking at what actually exists, and that leads to the more uncomfortable part of this discovery. What happens when the projection finally begins to collapse and the real person starts emerging from behind it? There's a strange moment that happens in some relationships. The person does exactly what they've done many times before. They say the same thing, repeat the same behavior, make almost the exact same mistake, but this time you see it. And once you see it, something changes. Maybe their behavior hasn't gotten worse at all. Maybe what changed was your ability to keep explaining it away. That's when the projection begins losing its power. In Jungian psychology, what we project onto other people can remain unconscious for a very long time. As long as it remains unconscious, we believe we're responding exclusively to the person in front of us. But part of the intensity of what we feel may actually belong to our own inner world. That's why someone can appear almost impossibly perfect, or impossibly terrible. Projection doesn't only idealize, we can also place onto other people aspects of ourselves that we're unwilling or unable to recognize. And this brings us to another fundamental Jungian concept, the shadow. The shadow represents aspects of our personality that we don't fully recognize, or that we'd rather keep outside the conscious image we've constructed of ourselves. Everyone has a shadow. The problem begins when we believe we don't. The less willing we are to recognize certain things within ourselves, the easier it becomes to see them exclusively in other people. That's one reason certain people provoke reactions in us that seem completely disproportionate. Sometimes what we condemn most violently in another person touches something unfamiliar within ourselves, but the opposite can happen too. What we desperately want to find in another person may reveal something we believe is missing inside us, and while these forces remain unconscious, the other person stops being just a person. They become a screen. You look at them, but you also see your fears, desires, needs, and fantasies projected across them, until reality begins breaking through the image, at first through small details. One broken promise, then another, a seemingly insignificant lie, an absence at exactly the moment you needed them most, a cruel remark followed by an apology, then the same cruelty again. What once seemed random begins developing a rhythm, and that rhythm reveals a pattern. This is psychologically difficult because patterns have an uncomfortable quality. Once you recognize them, they reorganize the past. You realize this didn't begin yesterday. It may have been in front of you for years. You simply had a different explanation for every incident. He was stressed. She had a difficult childhood. I made mistakes too. This time will be different. Notice what the mind can do. It can transform a pattern into a series of exceptions. Every event gets its own explanation, and as long as each event remains separate, we never have to put the pieces together. Because putting them together might force us to reach a conclusion we weren't ready to face. There's an enormous difference between understanding where a behavior comes from and denying that the behavior exists. Someone may carry trauma, they may be afraid, they may have deep emotional wounds. All of that can help explain why they behave the way they do, but explanation isn't transformation. Understanding the origin of a pattern doesn't make the pattern disappear. That distinction can free you from a very common trap, believing that because you understand someone deeply, you must continue accepting everything they do. You don't. Compassion doesn't require blindness. You can recognize someone's pain while also recognizing the pain they cause. You can understand their history without giving them permission to destroy yours, and maybe that's where the real person begins to appear. Not because you've finally uncovered some secret, permanent essence inside them, but because you've stopped erasing what their repeated behavior keeps showing you. There's a difference between judging someone for a mistake and observing a pattern. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone falls short of their better self. Everyone has a shadow. The question isn't whether someone is perfect. The question is what happens afterward. Is there accountability? Is there change? Is there repair? Or are there only apologies followed by the same behavior? Words can reveal intentions. Patterns reveal choices. And once you start paying attention to repeated choices, you may discover something painful. For a long time, you were listening to what someone promised while ignoring what they consistently practiced. That's when an internal conflict begins. One part of you sees it. Another part still wants to believe. One part says it's right in front of you. The other answers, maybe tomorrow will be different. This is how a projection can collapse slowly, not as some dramatic cinematic revelation, but as a succession of small deaths. One excuse dies, then another. An expectation disappears. A version of the future disappears with it, until eventually maintaining the old image requires more effort than accepting reality. And then you understand something you may have preferred not to know. Sometimes the person didn't change. You simply stopped filling the gaps in reality with hope. But this discovery leaves us with a deeper question. If the signs were there, why was it so difficult to see them? Why do people spend years defending images that, somewhere inside them, have already begun falling apart? The answer isn't only about the other person, it's also about us. Because seeing someone for who they really are can hurt, but discovering why we needed so badly to see them differently can hurt even more. There's a reason some truths reach us long before we're capable of accepting them. You notice, you feel it, you suspect something. Maybe you can even explain exactly what's happening, and yet you stay. Then comes the cruel question, if I already knew, why did I stay? The answer isn't always a lack of intelligence. Sometimes it's buried in the deepest parts of our own history, because recognizing who another person really is may also mean recognizing what we were trying to get through them. Love, validation, security, belonging, the feeling of finally being chosen. And this is where losing the illusion stops being merely a discovery about another person. It becomes an encounter with yourself. Imagine someone who has spent most of their life trying to prove that they're worthy of love. Maybe they learned very early that attention had to be earned. Be agreeable, don't cause problems, forgive quickly, give them another chance, then that person grows older. But what they learned about love doesn't simply disappear because the years have passed. Now they meet someone emotionally unavailable, and something strangely familiar happens. Instead of pulling away, they move closer. The less they receive, the more they give. The more the other person withdraws, the harder they try to prove their worth. Until the relationship stops being just a relationship, it becomes an unconscious mission. This time I'll make it work. This time the difficult person will choose me. This time my patience will be enough. This time my love will transform someone who cannot give me love in the way I need it. And when that happens, leaving can feel like something far greater than leaving a person. It can feel like abandoning the hope of finally healing an old wound. That's why people sometimes tolerate situations that seem incomprehensible from the outside. The person outside sees the behavior. The person inside is also living its meaning, and meaning can be far more powerful. From a Jungian perspective, what remains unconscious doesn't simply disappear. It can continue shaping our choices, attachments, and conflicts without us clearly understanding where those patterns come from. That's why certain patterns seem to follow people through their lives. The names change, the faces change, the places change, but somehow the story feels familiar. The person who always needs to save someone, the person who repeatedly falls for emotionally unavailable people, the person who accepts scraps and calls it patience, the person who mistakes intensity for intimacy, the person who believes having boundaries means being selfish. Maybe the problem isn't simply that we keep meeting the wrong people. Maybe something inside us is searching for what it already knows, and what we know isn't always what's good for us. Sometimes the familiar feels safe simply because it's familiar, even when it hurts. This is where seeing another person clearly becomes so painful, because you're not only losing the fantasy you had about them, you may also be losing a fantasy about yourself, the fantasy that if you love someone enough, you can change them, that if you're patient enough, they'll finally recognize your value, that if you give just a little more, you'll eventually receive what you've been waiting for. Then an uncomfortable truth appears. You cannot control another person's transformation. You can inspire them, you can talk to them, you can offer help, you can love them, but you cannot do for another person what only they can decide to do for themselves. Accepting that can create a profound sense of helplessness, especially for someone who has built an identity around being needed. Because hidden beneath many relationships is another question: who am I if nobody needs to be saved? That question opens the door to the shadow. Maybe you've always considered yourself generous, but some of that generosity contains hidden resentment. Maybe you insist that you expect nothing in return, while a quieter part of you desperately wants recognition. Maybe you call something love when, at times, it also contains a fear of being alone. Recognizing this doesn't make your feelings less genuine, it makes them more conscious. The shadow isn't only made of things we consider morally wrong, it also contains aspects of ourselves that don't fit the image we've constructed of who we believe we are. And when we begin recognizing those parts, something profound changes. You stop asking only, why did this person do this to me? And begin asking, what inside me made it so difficult to respond to what I was already seeing? That question doesn't make you responsible for another person's choices. It returns responsibility for your own choices to you. And there's a huge difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt keeps you trapped in the past. Responsibility asks what you're going to do now. Maybe you couldn't control what someone decided to do, but you can begin investigating why you stayed after certain signs appeared, why you were afraid to establish boundaries, why rejection felt so devastating, why you needed that particular person's approval so badly, and at that point something valuable begins returning to you. Parts of yourself that had been psychologically invested in someone else begin coming home. Your sense of worth slowly stops depending on their response. Your peace stops depending on whether they finally understand you. Your identity stops depending on whether they choose you. And maybe that's one of the most important discoveries in this entire process. Sometimes what we call losing someone is also the beginning of recovering ourselves. It doesn't happen all at once. You'll still miss them. You'll still experience contradictions. You may even feel tempted to return to the old fantasy. But now there's awareness. And awareness creates something that wasn't available before: choice. You no longer have to wait for another person to transform before you begin transforming your own life. And that brings us to the decisive question. What happens when you finally stop trying to change people? That's when clarity stops being only painful and begins becoming freedom. Maybe one of the biggest shifts in adulthood happens when you finally understand something remarkably simple. Loving someone doesn't give you the power to transform them. You can talk to them. You can offer advice. You can lead by example. You can give them opportunities. You can stand beside them through some of the hardest moments of their life. But there's a boundary that no amount of love can cross: their choice. For a long time, maybe you believed enough patience would eventually create change, that if you could only find the right words, they'd finally understand, that if you showed them enough love, they would eventually learn to love you in the same way. So you explained yourself more carefully. You forgave them again, you waited, you gave them another chance, then another, until eventually you realized something painful. You were trying to build by yourself a change that required two people. And this is where seeing someone for who they really are stops being merely a psychological realization. It becomes a decision, because now you have to choose between the person who exists and the person who continues to exist only in your hope. And that choice can be brutal, not because the other person is necessarily evil, but because they may simply be unable or unwilling to give you what you need. There's a difference between potential and reality. We all contain possibilities, but nobody has a relationship with possibilities. We have relationships with behavior, with choices, with what someone consistently does when nobody is trying to impress anyone anymore. That's why maturity isn't only asking, who could this person become? It's also asking, who are they choosing to be right now? That question pulls you out of an imaginary future and puts your feet back in the present. Maybe they'll change 5 years from now, maybe they'll mature, maybe they'll finally recognize their patterns, maybe they won't. But your life is happening now. And waiting indefinitely for someone else's transformation is also a choice with a cost, time, energy, self-respect, peace, sometimes entire years. Stopping your attempts to change people doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It doesn't mean abandoning someone after their first mistake. It means recognizing the difference between supporting someone's transformation and trying to create that transformation for them. You can walk beside someone. You cannot walk for them. You can show them a door. You cannot force them through it. And there's a quiet kind of freedom that arrives when you finally understand this, because a surprising amount of suffering disappears when we stop arguing with what's directly in front of us. Someone repeatedly shows you who they are, and you observe, without needing to hate them, without needing revenge, without needing to turn them into a villain to justify your decision. Maybe this is simply who they're capable of being right now, and maybe that's still not enough for them to remain close to you. Both things can be true. This kind of clarity requires something difficult, giving up the need for the other person to agree with your perception. You may never receive the apology you wanted. They may never admit what they did. They may continue telling a version of the story in which you're the problem, and then another kind of freedom appears. You realize you don't need everyone to understand you in order to understand what you experienced. Your peace doesn't have to depend on an outside verdict. Not every ending comes with an explanation. Sometimes closure happens when you stop asking the same question of someone who has already answered it through their behavior. That's when boundaries stop feeling like punishment. A boundary doesn't have to say, "You're a bad person." It can simply say, "I don't allow this in my life." There's a profound difference. You don't need to diagnose someone. You don't need to uncover every hidden reason behind their behavior. You don't need to win a psychological argument. You only need to decide what you're willing to participate in. And maybe that's one of the deepest consequences of finally seeing people clearly. You spend less energy trying to correct other people and more energy examining your own choices. Who do you allow to remain close to you? What behavior have you normalized? How often does your hope speak louder than the facts? How often do you call something love when it's actually fear of losing someone, and suddenly the journey turns back toward you? At the beginning you thought the problem was discovering who other people really were. Now you realize the more important question was always, who do you become once you're finally able to see them? Maybe you become more selective, maybe you talk less and observe more. Maybe you stop immediately believing promises and start paying attention to consistency. Maybe you learn that understanding someone's shadow doesn't mean allowing it to govern your life. And maybe you discover that some goodbyes aren't born from a lack of love. They're born from awareness. Because there comes a point when loving someone and staying with them no longer mean the same thing. You can love someone and leave. You can understand them and still set boundaries. You can forgive without going back. You can hope someone finds their way without continuing to lose yourself while walking beside them. That isn't coldness. It's differentiation. It's recognizing where another person ends and where you begin. And maybe that's what the collapse of projection ultimately gives us. The possibility of encountering real people. Imperfect, contradictory, human, without turning them into saviors, without turning them into monsters, without demanding that they become the characters our minds created for them. From that point forward, something changes. You stop asking, how can I make this person change? And start asking, given what I'm seeing, what am I going to choose? That question returns power to the only place where it can actually exist, your own decisions. Maybe the day you finally see people for who they are will also be the day some relationships end, but others may finally become real. Because only when fantasy loses its grip can we meet another person without demanding that they embody our desires, heal our wounds, or complete what we still need to discover within ourselves. And then you understand. Seeing clearly doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop loving an illusion. Maybe you'll never completely know another person. Maybe you'll never completely know yourself. But you can learn to observe. You can recognize patterns. You can withdraw projections. You can establish boundaries. And you can stop handing your life over to the hope that someone will eventually become something they never truly promised to be. In the end, the most important question isn't, when will they change? It's, now that I can see clearly, what am I going to do with what I see? Because maybe real freedom begins right there. Not when everyone around you finally changes, but when you no longer need them to change in order to choose your own path. Maybe after all of this, you'll realize that seeing people for who they are isn't about figuring out who's good and who's bad. It's something much harder, stopping yourself from replacing reality with hope. For a long time, we can love not only a person, but the person we imagine they'll eventually become. We wait for the conversation that will finally change everything, the apology that will prove they understood, the gesture that will confirm that everything we gave was worth it. And while we're waiting, we sometimes ignore what has already been shown to us again and again. But eventually, awareness asks a different question. Not, who could this person become? But, who have they consistently shown themselves to be? The difference seems small, but it can change an entire life, because as projections begin falling away, you stop relating only to promises, expectations, and possibilities. You begin paying attention to patterns, choices, reciprocity, accountability, and most importantly, what keeps happening even after all the conversations have taken place. Maybe some people will remain exactly as they are. And that may be one of the most liberating truths you'll ever encounter, because you finally understand that you don't need someone else to change before you can make a decision about your own life. You don't need them to acknowledge everything. You don't need an apology. You don't need them to understand your pain. You don't even need them to agree with you. Maybe the essential transformation isn't going to happen in them. Maybe it's going to happen in you. The moment you stop asking, how can I make this person treat me differently? And start asking, why am I continuing to stay where what I need simply isn't there? That's when the shadow stops being merely a psychological concept and becomes a mirror. You begin seeing your own fears, your need for approval, your difficulty establishing boundaries, the times you confuse sacrifice with love, the times you called something patience when perhaps it was really fear of leaving. That realization can hurt, but there's a difference between pain that traps you and pain that wakes you up. One keeps you repeating the same story, the other forces you to write a new one. Maybe that's what maturity really is, not becoming incapable of trust, not closing your heart, not seeing cruelty everywhere, but learning to love without becoming blind, to understand without explaining everything away, to forgive without necessarily returning, to recognize someone's potential without building your life around the promise that they'll someday fulfill it. Because there's a different kind of peace that appears when you stop fighting against what people repeatedly show you. You observe, you accept the information, and you choose. Some people will stay, others will need to remain at a distance, and some may disappear from your life completely, not necessarily because you stopped loving them, but because you finally stopped abandoning yourself just to keep them close. In the end, perhaps Jung leads us toward an even deeper realization. What we search for in other people often reveals unknown territories within ourselves. And when we withdraw our projections, we don't only discover more real versions of other people, we also recover parts of ourselves that had been hidden behind them, the strength you admired, the security you searched for, the sense of worth you kept waiting for someone else to confirm. Maybe some of that needs to be recovered within you, and then something quietly changes. You no longer need everyone to like you. You don't need to convince someone who's already decided not to understand. You don't need to chase reciprocity. You don't need to transform anyone. You simply observe who is capable of walking beside you without requiring you to disappear in order for the relationship to survive. Maybe that's where all of this was leading, to see clearly without hatred, to love without idealizing, to understand without abandoning yourself, and to have enough courage to accept that some people are exactly what they've been showing you they are for a very long time. When that day comes, you may feel as though you've lost some illusions, and you have. But in exchange, you may gain something far more valuable, the freedom to choose your life based on reality. So the next time someone repeatedly shows you who they are, before searching for another explanation, stay quiet for a few seconds, observe, and ask yourself, am I seeing this person, or am I still seeing who I wish they were? The answer may be uncomfortable, but it may be exactly the answer you needed in order to finally be free.